Iraq has just been hit. A storm so violent, so sudden, so catastrophic, that entire towns vanished underwater in hours. But here is what the news is not telling you. Before the storm hit, something was heard in the sky, and whatever it was, it has people terrified. Because according to an ancient text, written over 2,000 years ago, this was supposed to happen, and it is only the beginning. Right now, families in Iraq are sitting on rooftops, waiting for help that may never come. Right now, rivers that have flowed peacefully for thousands of years are swallowing entire communities whole. And right now, somewhere in the world, a recording exists of a sound that came from the sky before all of this started. A sound that no scientist has been able to fully explain. A sound that matches, almost perfectly, a description found in the oldest prophetic text ever written. Stay with this, because what is about to be revealed changes the way you look at everything happening in the world right now. It started without warning. One moment the sky over Iraq was open and dry. The next, it turned black. Not the slow, rolling darkness of an ordinary rainstorm. This was different. This was a wall of darkness moving across the landscape with speed and force that caught everyone off guard. People who had lived in that region their entire lives said they had never seen anything move like that. Never seen the sky change that fast. Never felt the air shift with that kind of weight behind it. The winds arrived before the rain did. That is one of the things that made this storm so unusual. Normally, you get some warning, a drop in temperature, a change in the smell of the air. But this time, the wind just came, full force, without introduction, strong enough to knock a grown man sideways, strong enough to strip the bark from trees that had stood for a generation, strong enough to send sheets of corrugated iron flying through the air like paper. In the rural areas outside the cities, farmers who had been working their fields had nowhere to go. The open land gave them no shelter, no protection. They ran for whatever structure they could find, and pressed themselves against walls, and prayed the roof would hold. Some roofs did not hold. In the towns, shop owners watched their storefronts fill with water and debris. Cars were pushed down streets by the force of water moving faster than anyone had anticipated. People who had been shopping, working, going about their ordinary Tuesday, suddenly found themselves wading through knee-deep floodwater trying to find higher ground. And the rain kept coming. Hour after hour, the sky poured water onto land that was already at its limit. The ground, hard and dry from months of scorching summer heat, could not absorb what was falling on it fast enough. So the water ran. It ran into the streets, into the fields, into the rivers. And the rivers did what rivers do when they receive more water than they can carry. They overflowed. And here is where this storm became something more than just a storm. Because the rivers that overflowed in Iraq are not ordinary rivers. They are not just lines on a map or sources of irrigation water. They are the Euphrates and the Tigris, two of the most historically significant bodies of water on the face of this earth. Rivers that appear in the Bible not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Rivers that flow through land the Bible calls the beginning of human civilization. Rivers that, according to ancient prophecy, will play a central role in the final events of human history. And on this particular day, those rivers turned against the people who lived beside them. The Euphrates River is approximately 1,740 miles long. It begins in the mountains of Turkey and flows through Syria before entering Iraq and eventually emptying into the Persian Gulf. For thousands of years, civilizations have built themselves around this river. Babylon was built beside it. Ancient Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, existed because of it. Entire empires rose and fell along its banks. The Tigris runs parallel to it, slightly east, slightly shorter, but no less important. Together, these two rivers created the conditions that allowed human civilization to take root and grow. They fed the soil that grew the food. They provided the water that built the cities. They are, in the most literal sense, the foundation on which human history was constructed. And in one storm, both of them became a source of devastation. The water levels rose faster than the monitoring systems could keep up with. By the time alerts were going out to riverside communities, the water was already in the streets. Families who received a warning had minutes, not hours, to respond. Some grabbed what they could. Most grabbed their children and ran. The provinces of Maesan and Muthana were among the hardest hit. These are regions where agriculture is the primary way of life. Farmers in these areas depend entirely on the land and the rivers to feed their families and generate income. When the floodwater came, it did not just damage their crops. It destroyed them completely. Fields that had been carefully prepared for harvest were buried under feet of sediment and standing water. Livestock that could not be moved in time drowned. Equipment that represented years of savings was ruined. The financial loss in these communities was devastating, but the emotional loss was something else entirely. These were people who had spent their lives working the same land their parents worked, the same land their grandparents worked, and in one night, that land was gone, not permanently perhaps, but gone in a way that would take years to recover from. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Roads that rescue teams needed to travel were underwater. Helicopters were deployed where they were available. But the sheer scale of the affected area made it impossible to reach everyone quickly. People waited on rooftops for hours. Some waited through the night. In the cities, hospitals filled with people who had been injured by flying debris, by collapsing structures, by the force of moving water. The injuries ranged from minor cuts and bruises to serious trauma. Medical staff worked through the night without rest, and through all of it the rain continued. Now here is something that needs to be said very clearly. Storms happen in Iraq. The region is not immune to severe weather, but what made this particular event stand out, what made people stop and talk, was not just the intensity of the storm, it was what happened before the storm arrived. Because before the rain fell, before the wind picked up, before the sky turned black, something happened that no meteorologist included in their report. A sound was heard. And that sound started a conversation that is still happening today. To understand the significance of this sound, it helps to start somewhere unexpected. Australia, thousands of miles from Iraq, on a day that seemed completely ordinary, a man stepped out of his home. The sky was overcast. There was a storm building on the horizon. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would normally make someone stop and pay attention. But then he heard it. A sound coming from the sky. Not from one direction. From everywhere at once. A deep, resonating, sustained sound that filled the air around him. He stood still for a moment because his brain was trying to identify what he was hearing and coming up empty. It was not thunder. Thunder rolls and fades. This did not fade. It held. It sustained itself like something deliberately producing the sound, rather than a random atmospheric event. It sounded like a trumpet. He took out his phone and recorded it. The video was not perfect. It was the kind of footage an ordinary person captures in an ordinary moment of confusion and curiosity. But when it was shared online, people listened, and they had the same reaction he did. They could not explain it. Not casually, not easily. Comments on the video ranged widely. Some people said it was clearly a natural atmospheric phenomenon, that certain pressure and temperature conditions can cause the air itself to vibrate in ways that produce musical-sounding tones. Others were not so sure. A small number of people mentioned something specific. They mentioned a passage from the Bible, a passage that describes the sound of trumpets as a signal, a warning, a marker that something is about to change. Hit. The reports were not uniform. Not everyone heard the same thing in the same way, but enough people mentioned it, in enough different locations, that the reports became notable. And when those reports were placed alongside the Australian recording, people began to pay attention in a different way. Is there a scientific explanation for sounds like this? Yes, there is. Changes in atmospheric pressure, wind moving through geological formations, certain types of electromagnetic activity associated with incoming storm systems can all produce sounds that resemble musical instruments. Infrasound, which is sound at frequencies below what humans can normally hear, can sometimes become audible under specific conditions and produce exactly this kind of sustained, trumpet-like tone. Those explanations are real, they are worth knowing, but they do not fully close the conversation. Because the question is not just what produced the sound. The question is why these sounds keep appearing in regions that are simultaneously experiencing the kind of large-scale disaster events that an ancient text predicted in extraordinary detail. That is a different question, and it does not have a simple scientific answer. What does the ancient text actually say? That is where this gets very specific, and very uncomfortable for anyone who assumed prophecy was just poetic imagery. The Bible is not a small book. It contains 66 individual texts, written by approximately 40 different authors, over a period of roughly 1,500 years. Despite that, it maintains a consistent internal narrative that begins with creation and ends with what it calls the consummation of all things. The final events of that narrative are described in extraordinary detail, and a significant portion of those details involve the Middle East. Specifically, they involve the land of Mesopotamia, the land between the Euphrates and the Tigris, the land that is today called Iraq. This is not a new observation. Biblical scholars have noted for centuries that the geographic specificity of end times prophecy is remarkable. The text does not describe vague, unidentifiable locations. It names rivers. It names regions. It names nations. And many of those named locations are currently at the center of global instability. The Book of Revelation, written by a man named John, approximately 2,000 years ago, while he was in exile on a small island called Patmos, describes a sequence of events that will unfold before the return of Jesus Christ. Those events include widespread natural disasters, storms, floods, darkness, extreme heat. These are not described as random weather patterns. They are described as signs, markers that the timeline is moving forward. Revelation chapter 8 describes 7 trumpets. Each trumpet signals a new wave of catastrophe. The first trumpet brings hail and fire mixed with blood, burning a third of the earth. The second brings something like a great mountain thrown into the sea, turning the waters to blood. The events described escalate in scale and intensity with each trumpet. Now here is something worth sitting with. The sound that was recorded in Australia, the sound that people in Iraq reported hearing before the storm, matches in a very specific way the imagery the Bible uses to describe these trumpet signals. The Bible uses trumpets as a signal for transition, for change, for the beginning of something that cannot be stopped or reversed once it starts. Is the Australian recording one of the biblical trumpets? Almost certainly not in a literal sense. But the question it raises is legitimate. The question it raises is this: if the Bible predicted that there would be signs in the sky and signs in the earth before the return of Christ, and if those signs would include things that could not be easily explained, then what exactly would those signs look like to a generation carrying smartphones? They would look exactly like what people are recording and sharing right now. But the trumpets are only one part of the picture, because before the final events unfold, the Bible describes something happening on the earth that makes the storm in Iraq look small by comparison, something involving a figure who rises to power during a period of global chaos, a figure who offers the world exactly what it wants. And the world takes it. The word Antichrist appears in the Bible in 2 different ways. The prefix anti in the original Greek language means 2 things simultaneously. It means against, and it means instead of. So the Antichrist is not just someone who opposes Jesus Christ. He is someone who positions himself as a replacement for Jesus Christ, a substitute, a counterfeit that is close enough to the real thing to fool people who are not paying careful attention. The Apostle Paul, writing to a group of early Christians in a city called Thessalonica, described this figure in a letter that is approximately 2,000 years old. He called him the man of sin, the son of perdition, the man of lawlessness, and the description he gave is remarkable in its specificity. Paul wrote that this figure would exalt himself above everything that is called God, that he would oppose all existing authority, that he would sit in the temple and declare himself to be God, that he would come with all kinds of counterfeit miracles, signs, and wonders designed to deceive people into following him. And then Paul wrote something that is easy to miss, but incredibly important. He wrote that the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. He wrote that in the 1st century, 2,000 years ago. He was saying that the spirit behind the Antichrist, the force that will eventually produce this figure, was already operating in the world at that time, already working, already building towards something. That means the Antichrist is not an event that appears out of nowhere. He is the culmination of a process that has been underway for a very long time, a process of gradual erosion, a process of slowly dismantling the foundations that hold society together, replacing them with something that looks like progress, but is actually preparation for deception on a global scale. Paul also wrote something else that is critical to understanding the timeline. He wrote that something was restraining the full manifestation of this evil. Something was holding it back, preventing it from fully emerging. And he said that when that restraining force is removed, the man of lawlessness will be revealed. What is that restraining force? Paul identified it as connected to the presence of believers in the world. The community of people who follow Jesus Christ, filled with the Holy Spirit, functions as a moral and spiritual counterweight to the darkness building around them. They are, in the language Jesus himself used, salt and light. Salt preserves. It slows decay. Light exposes what darkness tries to hide. When that salt is removed, when that light goes out, the decay that has been slowed will accelerate, and the darkness that has been held back will spread without limit. The event that removes believers from the earth is called the rapture. And understanding the rapture is essential to understanding what comes next. Most people who have heard the word rapture associate it with a specific image: people disappearing, cars crashing because their drivers suddenly vanished, planes falling from the sky. It is an image that has been used in movies, novels, and television shows to the point where many people assume it is fictional, the product of someone's imagination, rather than a serious theological concept. But the concept itself comes directly from the Bible, and it is described in more detail than most people realize. The Apostle Paul, in his first letter to the Thessalonians, addressed a concern that members of the early church had. They were worried about people who had already died. They believed that Jesus was coming back, but they wondered what would happen to believers who did not live to see that return. Had those people missed out? Were they lost? Paul's response was very specific. He wrote that when the Lord descends from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, the dead in Christ will rise first. Then those who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so they will always be with the Lord. The Latin word used when this text was translated into Latin, the language of the early Western Church, was rapturo. From that word comes the English term rapture. It simply means to be caught up, to be seized, to be taken suddenly. Paul described this event as happening in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the sound of the last trumpet. It is not a gradual process. It is instant. Now here is why this matters in the context of everything else being discussed. The Bible describes the rapture as happening before the final period of global tribulation begins. It happens before the Antichrist is fully revealed and empowered. It happens before the last and most intense phase of the disasters described in the book of Revelation, which means that everything happening right now, the storms, the floods, the unexplained sounds in the sky, the escalating global instability, all of it is happening before that moment. All of it is part of what Jesus described as the beginning of birth pains. Painful, yes. Alarming, yes. But not yet the worst of it. The birth pains are a signal that the birth is approaching, that the event being waited for is getting closer, that the timeline is moving. And the timeline has a sequence. Understanding that sequence changes the way a person looks at every news headline, every natural disaster, every unexplained event. Because the sequence is not random. It is not chaotic. It is moving towards something specific. Something the Bible describes in vivid and unmistakable detail. The second coming of Jesus Christ. The return of Jesus Christ is the most described future event in the entire Bible. It appears in the Old Testament as a promise. It appears in the words of Jesus himself as a guarantee. It appears in the letters of the apostles as a source of hope. And it appears in the book of Revelation as the climax of all human history. And the description that the Bible gives of this event is not vague. It is not symbolic. It is not the kind of language that leaves room for multiple interpretations about whether it is a literal physical event or a spiritual metaphor. Jesus himself, speaking to his disciples on the night before his crucifixion, said these words, "I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." That is not metaphorical language. That is the language of someone making a promise to return. After his resurrection, when Jesus ascended into the sky and was taken from the sight of his disciples, 2 angels appeared and spoke to the group of stunned men standing there watching. They said, "This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven." Like manner. The same way he left is the same way he will return. He left visibly. He left bodily. He left in a way that his closest friends could watch with their own eyes. And he will return the same way. The book of Revelation chapter 1 puts it in language that leaves nothing to interpretation. "Behold, he is coming with clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him." Every eye. Not just believers. Not just people who are looking for him. Every person on the earth will see this event. It will not be possible to miss it. It will not be something that happens in one part of the world, while other parts remain unaware. Revelation 19 describes the moment in dramatic detail. Heaven opens. A white horse appears. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True. His eyes are like a flame of fire. On his head are many crowns. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood. And the armies of heaven follow him, also on white horses, dressed in clean white linen. Out of his mouth comes a sharp sword, with which to strike down the nations. And he has a name written on his robe and on his thigh, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is not a quiet return. This is not a private, spiritual event. This is the return of the Creator of the universe to the planet he made, in power and in glory, to bring the age of human history to its conclusion, and to establish a kingdom that will have no end. And the Bible says this event is preceded by escalating signs. Signs in the natural world. Signs in the political world. Signs in the spiritual world. Signs that, when viewed together, paint a picture that is unmistakable for those who know what they are looking at. The storm in Iraq is one sign among many, but it is not isolated. It does not stand alone. It is part of a pattern that becomes very clear when you step back far enough to see the whole picture. Step back far enough, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. In the last several decades, the frequency and intensity of natural disasters around the world has been increasing. This is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It is measurable. It is documented. The number of recorded natural disasters per decade has been rising consistently since the mid-20th century. Floods, wildfires, earthquakes, hurricanes. Each decade brings more of them, more intense, affecting more people, causing more damage. Scientists attribute much of this to climate change, to population growth, to better disaster monitoring systems that capture events that previously went unrecorded. Those are legitimate contributions to the numbers, but they do not account for all of the increase. And they certainly do not account for the geographic specificity of where the most significant events are occurring. The Middle East, Central Asia, the regions surrounding the Mediterranean, the lands described in biblical prophecy with extraordinary geographic precision. These regions are at the center of global instability in ways that extend far beyond weather, wars, political upheaval, economic collapse, religious conflict. Every major tension point on the global stage seems to trace back to this part of the world, and within that region, Iraq sits at the epicenter. Iraq is the land of ancient Babylon. Babylon is one of the most referenced locations in the entire Bible. It appears in the early chapters of Genesis as the site of the Tower of Babel, the moment when human ambition first overreached itself on a global scale. It appears in the historical books as the empire that conquered Jerusalem and carried the Jewish people into exile. And it appears in the book of Revelation as a symbol of global corruption and opposition to God. Revelation chapter 18 describes the fall of Babylon in language so dramatic and so detailed that scholars have spent centuries debating exactly what it refers to. Some believe it refers to the ancient city literally rebuilt. Others believe it is a symbol for a global system of corruption. Either way, the geographic and symbolic importance of the land of Iraq to the biblical narrative is undeniable. And yet, of all the things happening in that region right now, there is one development that Bible scholars have been watching with particular attention. One specific event, currently unfolding, that matches a very specific prophecy in a way that is difficult to explain away. The Euphrates River is drying up, not quickly, not dramatically, slowly, quietly, consistently. The water level has been dropping for years. Turkey has built a series of dams upstream that restrict the flow of water into Syria and Iraq. Climate change has reduced rainfall in the source regions. The demand for water from the river has increased as populations have grown. The combination of these factors has been reducing the flow of the Euphrates to levels that experts describe as alarming. And Revelation chapter 16, verse 12 says this: "The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east." A river that appears in the most specific end times prophecy in the Bible is currently drying up in real time, and the same river just flooded catastrophically in the same season. That is the kind of detail that does not sit quietly in the back of your mind once you have heard it. But there is something else. Something that most people overlook when they read the prophecies. Something about the nature of the signs themselves. And understanding this changes the way a person reads every news story about natural disasters going forward. Jesus was asked directly by his disciples what the signs of his coming would be. The conversation is recorded in Matthew chapter 24, and it is one of the most detailed prophetic discourses in the entire New Testament. His answer was not a list of specific dates or a precise sequence of individual events. It was a description of a pattern, a type of environment, a set of conditions that would exist in the world as his return approached. He said there would be wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, earthquakes in various places. He said all of these things were the beginning of birth pains. Birth pains. That phrase is crucial, because birth pains are not random. They are not purposeless. They are the physical signal that something is coming, that a process that has been building for a long time is reaching its conclusion. And birth pains have a specific quality that is worth noting. They increase in frequency and intensity as the moment of birth approaches. They do not stay the same. They do not level off. They build. Each contraction is more intense than the last. The intervals between them get shorter. The body is being driven toward a moment of transition that cannot be stopped or reversed once it begins. Jesus described the signs of his coming in exactly those terms. Not as isolated events, but as a building pattern. Not as random occurrences, but as a sequence with direction and momentum. And he said that when these things begin to happen, his followers should look up, because their redemption is drawing near. He also said something that is easy to miss in the middle of all the dramatic language. He said that not everyone would recognize the signs for what they are. He said that the days before his return would be like the days of Noah. People eating, drinking, marrying, going about their lives, completely unaware that everything was about to change. Noah built an ark for 120 years before the flood came. For 120 years, people watched him work and dismissed him, mocked him, went about their business as if the warning was irrelevant. And then the rain started. And by the time they understood that Noah had been right, it was too late. Jesus said the same pattern would repeat itself before his return. Most people will not see it coming. Most people will be caught completely off guard. Not because the signs were not there. Not because there was no warning. But because they chose not to look. because they decided that the ordinary rhythms of their daily lives were more important than paying attention to what was happening around them. That is a sobering statement, and it raises a personal question that cannot be answered for anyone else. Only for yourself. Are you paying attention? And if you are, what are you doing about what you see? Everything covered so far has been about events, disasters, prophecies, patterns, timelines. But at some point, the conversation has to shift from the global to the personal. Because at the end of the day, what is happening in Iraq, what is happening in the skies over Australia, what is happening along the banks of the Euphrates River, none of it matters in the way it should unless it prompts a personal response. And the personal response the Bible calls for is not complicated. It is not a list of rules. It is not a religious performance. It is not something that requires years of theological training to understand or access. It is a relationship, a simple, direct, personal relationship with Jesus Christ. The Bible describes Jesus as standing at a door and knocking. The image is simple, and the meaning is clear. He does not break the door down. He does not force entry. He stands at the door and he knocks. And if the person on the other side opens the door, he comes in. That is it. That is the entirety of what the Bible asks. Not perfection, not a lifetime of religious observance before you qualify. Just an open door, just a willingness to say, I hear you knocking, and I am opening the door. The people of Iraq who lost everything in this storm deserve prayer. Real, genuine prayer. Not as a social gesture, not as a verbal formality, but as a genuine appeal on behalf of people who are suffering. People who are sleeping on rooftops or in temporary shelters. People who are trying to understand why this happened and whether things will ever get back to normal. People who are carrying grief and fear and exhaustion in equal measure. But the storm in Iraq is also a reminder, a loud, visible, undeniable reminder that life is fragile, that the things a person builds can be washed away in a night, that there is no guarantee of tomorrow, and that the most important decision a person will ever make is not a financial decision or a career decision or a relationship decision. It is a spiritual decision, a decision about where they stand in relation to the one the Bible says is coming back. Because according to everything the Bible says, that return is not distant. It is not something for future generations to worry about. The signs are here now. The patterns are visible now. The invitation is open now. And the one thing the Bible is absolutely clear about is that no one knows exactly how much time is left. No one knows the day or the hour. Which means that treating it as something to deal with later is the most dangerous assumption a person can make. Before getting to the ending, there is one more thing that needs to be addressed, and it is something that Jesus specifically warned about in his discussion of the end times: false prophets. Jesus said that as his return approached, many false prophets would arise. He said they would perform signs and wonders. They would speak with confidence and authority. They would claim to speak for God. They would claim to have special knowledge about the end times that other people did not have, and they would deceive many people, not a small number, not a handful of gullible individuals, many. This is not a minor footnote in the biblical account. Jesus dedicated a significant portion of his end times discourse to warning about false prophets. He clearly considered it one of the primary dangers of the period leading up to his return. What does a false prophet look like? In the biblical context, a false prophet is not necessarily someone who is obviously wrong or obviously evil. In fact, the most dangerous false prophets are the ones who are mostly right. They use real scriptures. They reference real events. They make predictions that sometimes come true. They wrap their deception in enough truth that people who are not careful mistake the package for something legitimate. The test the Bible provides for identifying a false prophet is not complicated. One test is whether their predictions come true. A genuine prophet of God is accurate. Not sometimes, consistently. Another test is whether their teaching leads people toward Jesus Christ, or away from him. A genuine message from God will always ultimately point to Christ, to his redemptive work, to his coming. Any message that diminishes Christ, replaces Christ, or substitutes something else for Christ, is not from God, regardless of how impressive its packaging appears. And a third test is this. Be very suspicious of anyone who claims to know the exact day and hour of Christ's return. Jesus said explicitly that no one knows that, not the angels, not even the Son in his earthly ministry, only the Father. Anyone who tells you they know exactly when Christ is returning is claiming knowledge that Jesus himself said was not available to any creature in existence. This matters right now, because as disasters increase in frequency and intensity, as global instability makes people anxious and desperate for answers, the market for false prophets grows. People in fear will listen to voices that offer certainty, even if that certainty is manufactured. People who feel out of control will follow anyone who seems to have a map of what is happening. The antidote to false prophecy is not skepticism. It is not a refusal to engage with biblical prophecy at all. The antidote is exactly what Paul described in his letters. Know the Word. Read it yourself. Understand what it actually says, rather than depending entirely on someone else's interpretation of it. Because black print on white paper, interpreted by the Holy Spirit into an open and willing heart, is more reliable than any preacher, any televangelist, any YouTube channel, any book, any podcast. And speaking of which, everything being said here is meant to point back to that, to the text itself, not to create a following or establish an authority, but to point toward the source, because the source is where the answers actually are. Here is where everything lands. Iraq was hit by a storm, towns flooded, families lost everything. Strange sounds were heard in the sky. Ancient prophecies were written about these exact regions thousands of years ago. The Euphrates is drying up. The signs Jesus described are appearing with increasing frequency. The pattern is visible to anyone willing to look at it honestly. And somewhere in a region the Bible describes with chilling specificity, something else is happening right now. A development that has been unfolding quietly over the past several months. An event that, when placed alongside the prophecies in the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, matches in a way that stops serious Bible scholars in their tracks. This is not about another storm. It is not about another flood. It is about a political and geographic shift in the Middle East that aligns with a very specific prophecy that has not yet been fully addressed. A prophecy about alliances, about nations, about a coalition described in detail thousands of years before those nations existed in their current form. That coalition is forming right now. The pieces are moving into place in real time. And if those pieces land where the prophecy says they will, the next phase of the biblical timeline will have begun. That story is the next piece of this. And it is more specific, more current, and more urgent than anything covered here. The clock is moving. The signs are multiplying. And the question that matters most, the only question that will still matter when everything else has been swept away, is a simple one. Where do you stand?